Hi, this is Lynn McCool, and today I want to talk to you about the canon of arrangement, organizing and creating structure within your speeches. As you know, last time we did a little review of Aristotelian rhetoric. We touched on the five canons: invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. And we talked also about how in the Aristotelian form of argumentation that Aristotle likes to use induction, which is looking at specific instances or cases and then moving to a general principle. And of course, Aristotle talks about the fact that with induction, we make use of something called the rhetorical syllogism, which looks at the enthymemes or hidden assumptions of an argument. And in that rhetorical syllogism, then, the rhetor often uses examples and signs to help build his case. We have talked in the past about the rhetorical situation and the fact that this is one way to describe the relationship between the speaker and the writer, the subject or the message, and the audience. And you can see that this is an interactive process, so going back and forth between each of the 3 points on the triangle. The rhetorical situation is always prefaced by some kind of exigence, which is the situational problem that causes the speaker or the writer to begin the communication in the first place. All communication, of course, is bounded by its context, so the particular situation, setting, number of individuals or key actors or players, as well as the purpose for the communication. We also reviewed over the rhetorical appeals, those artistic appeals that Aristotle says that the rhetor invents in order to create a persuasive argument. And of course that is the appeals of logos, pathos, and ethos. Logos is logic or rational thought, pathos, emotion or feeling, and of course ethos is the credibility or the trustworthiness of the speaker. Today I want to focus in on the second of the 5 canons, which is arrangement, and talk about a classical model of arrangement that you might find to be helpful and useful in the construction of your persuasive speech. And then also after that, I will spend a little bit of time of talking about different rhetorical modes that you could use within that classical model of arrangement. So these are different methods or modes of organizing and looking at content material in a way that is structured and gives organization to the body of the speech itself. So as you know, arrangement has to do with the organization of the speech, and it goes beyond the introduction, middle, and conclusion kind of mindset. So it's more complicated and sophisticated than just a broad intro, body, and conclusion. So the organization also includes how a speaker might structure the argument within the speech framework. In the classical model of arrangement, classical rhetoricians outlined a 5-part structure for oratory that speakers still use today, although perhaps they don't always consciously use it, but it is often used today, whether consciously or unconsciously. So there are 5 parts to this classical model of arrangement. The first part is the introduction. It was known as the exordium. And in the exordium, the speaker introduces the reader or the listener to a subject under discussion. Exordium itself in Latin means beginning a web, and I think that that's a really great mental picture of what we're trying to do for the listener. We're trying to create a set of interconnected ideas and show how these ideas all work together for one purpose. And of course, that purpose is to persuade the listener of a certain stance on a topic. So your introduction would serve to draw the reader in, pique interest, get attention, or challenge the reader. And of course, your introduction is a great place to establish your ethos. The second part of the classical model of arrangement is the narration or narratio, and this provides factual information and background material on the subject. Typically, if you were writing out the entire manuscript of your speech, this would be a developmental paragraph which establishes why the subject is a problem and why it needs addressing, and also why the audience should care about it. The level of detail in the narratio depends largely upon the audience's knowledge of the subject And so you do have to do audience analysis. It's very important that you understand who your audience is, what their needs are, how much information they might need in order to feel fully confident in understanding the position that you're going to bring to them. Although the classical model of rhetoric would describe narration as appealing primarily to logos, logic, actually in our modern day argumentation, this part of the model often speaks to pathos because the speaker attempts to evoke some kind of emotional response about the importance of the issue being discussed, and that often is first brought up here in the narratio. The third in the five-part construction of the classical model of arrangement is the confirmation or the confirmatatio. Now, this is usually the major part of the speech, and it includes the development of the proof needed to make the speaker's case. It contains the most specific and concrete details that you'll find in the speech. Of course, this is where you would want to bring in the majority of your research and use your quoted and cited sources to back up claims that you're making. So the confirmation makes the strongest appeal to logos inside of this five-part structure. Okay, the fourth part is the refutation or refutatio, and this is the point in the speech where the speaker addresses the counter-argument, and oftentimes this addressing the counter-argument will serve as a bridge from the speaker's proof that he had laid out earlier in the speech and the conclusion, which is still yet to come. Now, it's kind of interesting that the refutation often comes towards the end of the speech before the conclusion. There is an alternate way to organize that. You could place it throughout the speech if there are many well-known counter-arguments that you have to address and it makes sense to do so. But my preference is that you would organize it in this way where it comes right before the conclusion. If you find that your particular topic lends itself better to this alternate organization, then I'll ask that you conference with me on that, because it takes very careful structuring and organization to make that effective and to use it well. And so if you do need to use that alternate method of addressing the counter-argument, then please talk to me first. So the counter-argument's appeal, again, is largely to logos, and it's the space where you briefly acknowledge that there are other viewpoints on the issue, but then you also refute those other viewpoints with additional argumentation that you bring forward. Okay, the fifth part and final part of the classical model is the conclusion, or the peroratio, and this can be quite a bit longer. This conclusion on the classical model could be quite a bit longer than the conclusion that you might have given for your AFC speech, because in the conclusion of a persuasive speech, we here again want to appeal to pathos. We want to remind the reader of our ethos that we've established earlier. And if in the narratio you have introduced some kind of narrative, which I would recommend that you do, because that's a great way to put a human face onto the issue at hand. So if you've introduced some sort of narrative in the narratio, then what you can do is, in that initial introduction of that narrative, just tell a little bit of it, but don't finish the story until you get to the conclusion, where you pick it back up again and finish out the narrative. And of course, the narrative should be so tied into the topic, and it should be such an integral part of the persuasion of your particular stance, that by concluding the narrative at the same time that you're concluding the speech, it provides a very powerful appeal to pathos, as well as brings in a sort of almost a subconscious connection to the logical, rational bits of information that you've given in the body of the speech. So it's a really, really effective way to, it's called bookending, where you begin with the narrative, then you wait and you conclude with the conclusion of the narrative at the end of the speech. Now, also in the conclusion, rather than just simply repeating what has been said before, your conclusion should should bring together all of the speaker's ideas. So you do summarize all your ideas, but then you go one step further and you answer the question of so what. So basically the audience is sitting there, they're listening to you, they hear you repeat one last time the major points of your argument, and so then what you need to do is connect the dots for them. Okay, so you've told me this, so what? What should I do about it? And that's the next step then. You actually give the audience a call to action, give them the means or the way in which that they can move forward and act on this particular issue in whatever manner you deem appropriate. So the last words and ideas of the speech are usually the ones that are best remembered, and so those are the ones that need to be most clearly articulated. And again, you want to connect on all three levels: logos, pathos, and ethos here in the conclusion of the speech. Okay, now let's talk about some patterns of development that you might use inside of that classical model of arrangement. So these are ways of looking at content or looking at information and ways that we can organize and develop that information inside the body of the speech so that it makes sense to the listener. The first way is narration, and I already touched on that briefly, talking about that. There's actually a section right after the introduction called the narratio, or the narration, that gives the background to the topic at hand. As you know, narration has to do with telling stories, and so those stories can be based on your own personal experience, or they can be stories that you've gained from reading or from going to those common places, the topoi, from your own observation and so forth. Typically, chronological organization is how a narrative is constructed, because a story doesn't make sense if it doesn't follow a chronological order for the most part. Now, we're using narration not just as a simple crafting of an appealing story, but we are crafting a story to support your main point or your thesis, whatever it is that you want the audience to understand. The next one is description. Description goes hand in hand with narration. It emphasizes the senses by painting a picture of how something looks, sounds, smells, tastes, or feels. It can be used to create a mood or an atmosphere. Clear and vivid description can make your writing more persuasive, and narration and description often work together. I don't know of any story, at least any well-told story, that doesn't include a fair amount of description and detail as well. Okay, another mode of rhetorical mode is something called process analysis. This is explaining how something works, or how to do something, or how something is done. And the key to process analysis is clarity. So you have to explain your subject clearly and logically, and you need to use transitions to mark the sequence, either of the major steps, or there's steps to doing something, or stages or phases of the process. Those have to be clearly marked. And so for you as a speaker, clearly marking means actually overtly saying, first, second, third, or step one, step two, or cause one, cause two, things like that. All right, the next kind of rhetorical mode that's available for use is something called exemplification. This is using a series of examples or facts or specific cases or instances, and we look at each one of these discrete elements, and then from that we extrapolate some kind of general idea into a concrete principle. Examples can make your argument clearer and more persuasive to the reader and the listener. And of course, we know what Aristotle thinks about examples. He thinks that they can be extremely persuasive in trying to convince the audience of something. A speaker may use one extended example all throughout the entire speech, or another method is to use a series of related examples to illustrate a point. So all of these different specific instances point back to some sort of general truth that you want the audience to see. Aristotle, of course, taught that examples are a type of logical proof, and he called that induction. And remember, induction uses a series of specific examples to reach a general conclusion. Okay, I'm going to stop the discussion and pick it back up in part 2. So pick up part 2 of this classical arrangement discussion and we will finish it out. Thanks.